Okay, so hello, welcome back, or welcome if this is the first day for you. But this is the second day of our symposium, Pan-Asianism and Beyond, the past, present, and future of inter-Asian connections. And yes, and this symposium is organized by Koch University Center for Asian Studies and supported by the Japan Foundation. And yesterday we already had 5 wonderful presentations, very dense in its content, and I personally learned a lot, and very fruitful conversation discussion as well. And today I look forward to another set of 5 presentations, and just quickly to show what kind of presentations we have. Well, these are from yesterday. We had all these presentations. And today in the morning, right now, we have Christopher Lamont and Seiko Mimaki, mainly talking about this idea, persisting idea of Pan-Asianism in international relations mostly after World War II. And then in the afternoon, we have 3 papers from Ozen Nergis, Dolce Roca, and Ezra Gokche Shahin, and myself, Aiko Takeuchi Demerzi. And again, looking at Pan-Asianism, but also from different perspectives, from culture, literature, and activism. Okay. So with further ado, I would like to start by introducing our first speaker this morning, Professor Christopher Lamont. So Professor Lamont is an Assistant Dean and Associate Professor of International Relations at Tokyo International University. Previously, he was a tenured assistant professor at the University of Groningen in Netherlands and a Fulbright scholar at the University of Zagreb in Croatia. His work on transnational justice and human rights in the Middle East and North Africa and Southeastern Europe has appeared in leading scholarly journals, including the Journal of Democracy, Global Policy, International Journal of Human Rights, among others. His writings have also appeared in general interest journals such as Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. He is the author of Research Methods in International Relations, second edition published 2021. He is also co-author of New Critical Spaces in Transnational Justice, published by Indiana University Press in 2019, and Non-Western Visions of Democratization, Imaging Democracy After the Arab Spring, which was published by Routledge in 2015. And his monograph, International Criminal Justice and the Politics of Compliance, published in 2010, explored the international and domestic politics of international criminal justice processes. So with that, I'm very excited to have Professor Lamont. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Professor Takeuchi Demerzi. I'd like to start by first, I guess, getting my PowerPoint, sharing that, but also thanking the organizers of this seminar for putting together a kind of really wonderful event. I really learned a lot from yesterday's speakers, and particularly helped me contextualize some of the things that I'm going to talk about in this particular presentation, because I'm approaching this from the perspective of international relations and more contemporary politics. And I'll get into the kind of the rationale, but kind of trying to look backwards. The things that Japanese diplomats were saying kind of in the present seem to draw on concepts and ideas that were deeply rooted in the past. So looking at kind of Pan-Asianism after kind of the Second World War and Japan's reestablishment of connectivities and ties with the Middle East after the Second World War. And here on this kind of initial PowerPoint, you'll see one of the people who I will be talking about in a little bit. And one of the people who was mentioned, I believe, by Professor Saller yesterday is kind of one of the other kind of prominent, but not able to kind of mention in great detail figures within kind of the pre-war Pan-Asianist movement. He's looking kind of very kind of satisfied there. And he's actually in Tunis, in Sidi Bou Said. Nakatani Takeyo, who was at the time the head of the Japan-Arab Association, who I'll talk about in a little bit. So how did we get here, and where does this kind of presentation come from? Well, I started out by kind of doing some work on Japan's diplomatic outreach to the Middle East over the course of the kind of 2000 and teens. And there was quite a bit of interest at the time, in part because the Prime Minister at the time, Abe Shinzo, sought to emphasize kind of a distinct Japanese policy towards the Middle East, which raised a general kind of question of how Japanese diplomacy saw itself in the region, but also how Japanese diplomacy was perceived in the Middle East. And so when looking at this kind of exceptionalism, Abe in about 2015 kind of chose 3 terms to characterize Japan's approach to the region that implicitly sought to draw distance, interestingly, between Tokyo's policies and policies of other kind of states, like particularly interestingly, the United States and European Union partners, which were at the time in 2015, especially with regards to the person who you see here in this picture, who's with Abe Shinzo, Egypt's president Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who came to power in a military coup. There was growing criticism of Sisi's quashing of human rights, but at the same time, Abe goes and visits and sets out kind of 3 pillars of what he characterizes as Japan's approach to the region, which he sets out at a meeting of the Egyptian-Japanese Chamber of Commerce, which are harmony and tolerance, coexistence and co-prosperity, and collaboration. And kind of very openly embraced kind of Sisi at a time, as I mentioned, when human rights criticisms were growing. But it's not just that. There's kind of actual substance to these diplomatic outreach efforts, such as in 2017, when Japan initiated the first Japan-Arab political dialogue hosted by the League of Arab States. And here again, you have the outlining of diplomatic principles, this time by at the time Japan's foreign minister, Kono Taro, who referred to these as, or these referred to as the Kono principles. I don't know if he referred to them himself as the Kono principles, but they were referred by the foreign ministry to as the Kono principles that would guide Japan's policies towards the Middle East. And so, of course, again, these are kind of largely aspirational, somewhat vague principles that were stated. And the first was intellectual and human contribution, which referred to the strengthening of bonds that have been created by over 12,000 JICA experts being dispatched to the region, along with about 3,500 Japanese overseas cooperation volunteers. Second was kind of investment in people, and here what was emphasized was kind of Japan's own development experience and highlighting the critical role that education played, and was committed to providing more assistance, promote education and human resources. And kind of along those lines, education has figured prominently in Japan-Egypt relations. Egypt does host an overseas Japanese university. And there are actually some that I'll get into later a little bit in this presentation, longstanding ties between Egypt and Japan. And some of that we heard about kind of going even further into history, of course, in the first day, but of course, kind of Cairo University in the early 1970s established a Japanese language department, so to train Egyptians in Japanese language and also literature and culture. And the third, of course, was kind of enduring efforts, which was meant to signal a long-term commitment to the region. And the fourth, kind of probably the most kind of problematic, was enhancing political efforts, something that probably was not entirely something that Tokyo was very enthusiastic about embracing, which sought to convey the hope that Japan would play a greater political role in the region. And so one of the things that I'll look at in the first part of this presentation, which is kind of, will take us back to these critical juncture years, like 1950s to 1960s, are people that might not necessarily be people that you would have heard of in the context of Japanese diplomatic history or Japan's international relations. And part of the reason why is that this paper seeks to draw on the concept of space travelers, in a sense, kind of not those going to space, but kind of people who move between spaces, in particular, can be policy, cultural promotion, and activism. And it's an exploration of how concepts travel and evolve over, some of these concepts have traveled and evolved over time and space. And so therefore, what I do is I'll start with kind of a broader kind of introduction to kind of who some of these agents are and people who are moving between these spaces at the kind of the dawn, I guess, of post-war Japanese diplomacy, how some of these pre-war concepts were brought into kind of this lexicon of diplomacy, how Japan's early diplomatic outreach was perceived in that period. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in on one particular country, and that's Libya, because Libya is interesting in a sense that here you have the kind of the greatest separation between Japanese kind of foreign policy interests that had by the time coalesced into kind of putting kind of the US-Japan alliance in a privileged space, and a country that espoused from the early 1970s kind of a more radical Pan-Arabist ideology, and also was kind of eventually became kind of a pariah in the eyes of Washington, but was a country that Japan sought to maintain relations with during this period. So as I mentioned first, we'll go back to this kind of period of 1952 to 1960, kind of the reestablishment of relations. And just for the point of like purpose of clarity, the focus of this is really on Japan's interactions with Arab states and the Arab world, to put Libya in somewhat kind of greater context. And so just to go through kind of just a brief kind of timeline of kind of rebuilding these connectivities after the war. I mean, a lot of this was dominated by kind of very kind of material shipping interests like NYK shippings, kind of negotiation of kind of resumption of shipping through the Suez, early kind of reestablishment of diplomatic relations, in some cases with countries that Japan had relations with before, such as Iran, and then very early on, the dispatching of Japan's first post-war delegation to the region, which kind of not just symbolically, but importantly included kind of in the material sense, NYK President Asao Shinsuke as kind of having led that, as leading that delegation, visiting kind of countries that were identified at the time as kind of key interlocutors in the region, such as Egypt, Lebanon, Turkey, Syria, Iran, Jordan, and of course, Saudi Arabia. Also 1953, although it's not really the focus of this paper, it's worth noting you had also something that became kind of popularized among kind of the right much later on, something that was known as the Idemitsu incident in May, where Japan had imported oil directly from Iran following Iran's nationalization of Iranian oil from Anglo-Iranian Oil, which kind of sued, of course, which filed a complaint in Tokyo and illustrated some kind of tension between Japan and they kind of previously were Japan had been getting its oil from kind of the major Anglo-American dominated oil majors, and kind of there's some distance being drawn there in terms of the pursuit of Japan's interests in the region. Of course, Japan-Syria trade agreement, 54, diplomatic relations established with Jordan, and Iraq opens an embassy in 55, and then kind of Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Japan establish diplomatic relations in 55. And 56 is interesting because here you have a greater awareness of, well, the Middle East is important, but there aren't a lot of resources being devoted to the region within the foreign ministry, and there's kind of a lack of knowledge, expert knowledge of the region as well. And so you have the establishment of a Middle Eastern room within the foreign ministry that's tasked with kind of following and understanding developments in the Middle East. And then you have in 57 another trip, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a few minutes, where you saw a delegation like Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and Tehran. And here you had kind of big names and some kind of later to be big names like Shimanoka Yasuburo, Nakasone Yasuhiro, and of course, the gentleman that was in the kind of the very first cover slide, Nakatani Takeyo, kind of having been dispatched to the region. And also here you have kind of deepening ties with Iran, also Egypt, and 57, kind of the establishment of diplomatic relations with Libya. And kind of by the end of the decade, you have kind of restoration, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia opening an embassy in Tokyo, and also the visit of the Iranian Shah. And so with that as kind of context, what does this mean? Well, generally speaking, the priorities seem to reflect kind of the interests, kind of largely, as you see, not surprisingly, shipping interests by kind of NYK, and in policy struggled to cope with also kind of the demands of radical political spaces that had opened in the post-war era in many of these countries that I had just mentioned, and encountered ideas such as Pan-Arabism, that confronted kind of a lot of these more conservative, post-colonial kind of monarchical elites, framing them as kind of sclerotic or subservient to the West. And it also created this kind of opening in a way for connectivities between some of these people who we heard about yesterday as wartime Pan-Asianist ideologues, and also post-war kind of Pan-Arabist movements. But of course, all of this was out of sync with Tokyo's post-war foreign policy priorities, which was during this decade becoming kind of deeper, more and more entangled in the US alliance system in the context of the Cold War. And so Nakatani Takeyo, during this kind of post-war period, reinvents himself from kind of a pre-war Pan-Asian militarist to an anti-colonial Pan-Afro-Asian activist. And he kind of makes reference a lot to those people, again, a lot of the leading figures in the movement that we had heard about yesterday. And kind of when he went on that 1957 delegation to MENA, he saw himself as continuing the work of people like Okawa Shume and Mitsukawa Kametaro. And so kind of he himself draws this kind of red line between kind of his activism after the war and his pre-war activities. And so just to kind of present here is kind of a picture of him from like a NHK documentary, kind of exploring some of the sordid things that he was up to before the war. I mean, he was from Wakayama, studied at Tokyo Imperial University, so not the TIU that exists today, that's up in Kawagoe, but the old Tokyo University. He became a lecturer at Hosei in 1927. Of course, he was kind of also a director of joined and became a director of the Greater Asia, one of these organizations that, again, we had heard about yesterday. But he was also a right-wing publicist, also tied to some of the newspapers that we had heard about, involved in some of the newspapers we'd heard about yesterday. It also was tied to kind of acts of political violence and other kind of right-wing violent groups during these interwar years. And he was eventually elected to the Diet in 1942 with the blessing of the Imperial Rule Association. And so he was one of these Pan-Asianists who had kind of become kind of operated at fringes and became kind of moved closer to kind of the halls of power, but he never really was kind of at the center, so to speak. One of the things that he comes back to a lot, and that is visible a lot in what we will see in his kind of involvement during this period, is this kind of creation of this hyper revisionist post-war Pan-Asian narrative, which he writes about a lot, in a sense, kind of twists, like making the argument that Japan had won. Pan-Asianist cause had won the Second World War through the liberation of millions of people across the MENA region. And so in his kind of one of his books, he wrote after the war, Arabu to Nihon Arabu Koryushi, right? He wrote, as a result of World War II, Asian nations were able to develop and achieve independence. And this was through Japan's sacrifice and defeat in the Second World War. Also, he claimed to have played a leading role in promoting the completion of independence for about 120 million Arabs who lived in the Middle East, North Africa, through cooperation with and modernization of these independent Arab nations. And so what's interesting is in 57, Nakatani is one of the founders of this kind of new association that pops up in Tokyo, and that's the Japan-Arab Association. And it still actually exists today, although it mainly focuses on kind of cultural activities and endeavors. But at the time when it was founded, it was it was actively involved in kind of the promotion of Pan-Arab ideas and leaders in Japan, and sought to promote leaders like Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser and other Pan-Arabist causes in the region. And kind of some of their early writings, Arab monarchies were characterized as conservative, subservient to Western interests, sclerotic, and kind of Pan-Arabism framed as emancipatory. And but it's important to point out that Nakatani himself was ideologically incoherent and all over the place. He seems to kind of fall back on some of those core ideas that I believe both Saller and Spillman had mentioned yesterday, as kind of being kind of more of an admiration of autocrats and strongmen leaders and hyper-militarized societies. He wrote about kind of post-war militarization of Yugoslav society, which had fought a partisan kind of war against Nazi occupation during the Second World War, and expressed admiration for what he saw as kind of Belgrade in the 1950s as being a society that was hyper-militarized, but also under a kind of authoritarian leadership. But what makes this also curious is kind of the approach US foreign policy took to Pan-Arabism during this kind of same period of time. So you're looking at kind of a idea which was not monolithic, many different forms, had many different kind of expressions, but generally centered around the advocation of political and cultural and socioeconomic unity of Arabs and of Arab peoples. And at the time, US foreign policy saw this kind of Pan-Arab nationalism as radical anti-American political force, and gravitated towards favoring maintenance of relations with more conservative monarchical elites, and talked about efforts to kind of contain Pan-Arab nationalism from spilling out beyond the Near East and undermining other pro-Western regimes. But despite kind of the US foreign policy, and also kind of curiously, also Nakatani kind of seemingly viewed Pan-Arabism as a singular force and not monolithic. It, as I mentioned, took on many different forms. Kind of, in one of the things that Nakatani was focused on was, of course, the aftermath of the Egypt Free Officers Revolution in 1952 and the anti-imperialist and anti-colonial messaging, which resonated, or which he saw as resonating a lot with kind of the earlier Pan-Asianist discourses. But of course, in the 1950s, Japan's priority was the restoration of trade relations and trade routes across the Middle East. So Nakatani had embraced Pan-Arabism as ideologically adjacent to Pan-Asianism. And the establishment, of course, of the Japan-Arab Association also coincided with kind of major developments within the Pan-Arabist movement, such as Nasser's establishment of United Arab Republic in 1958, and his journal, Arabu, which I'll talk a little bit more about today, kind of consistently in its early editions advocated for Arab unity positions. It even included guest contributions from the Pan-Arabist diplomatic corps in Tokyo. And Pan-Arabism was also promoted through kind of both political and cultural messaging. And interestingly, that to a certain extent, Japan's early diplomatic outreach emphasized Japan's anti-colonialism is something that resonated. And so, I mentioned earlier, Nakasone being on one of these trips to the Middle East. And kind of here, he talks about thanking Nasser for having supported Japan's admission to the United Nations, but also telling him that the Japanese people supported Egypt's nationalization of the Suez Canal, and explaining that Japanese diplomacy was in favor of national self-determination and anti-colonialism and the spread of international democracy. But of course, Nakatani kind of went further than that, and so here's kind of a cover of kind of Arabu, one of the 19th edition of this journal, again, which still exists today, but again is kind of not kind of doing the same kind of political messaging that it was doing back when Nakatani was playing a leading role in the organization and editing the journal. But Nakatani's advocacy went further than kind of this anti-colonialism, and interestingly maintained this kind of very binary worldview, this hard anti-Westernism. And he wrote things like the expulsion of Western colonialism was the backbone of Arab nationalism. And he talked about the emergence of kind of the Federation of Arab Republics, which was another Pan-Arabist plan that didn't work, in this kind of proposed unity between kind of Libya and Egypt, whose leaders you see on the cover of this edition, not only added tremendous power to the Arab nation, but also as a new stabilizing force in the Middle East, and will be promoting power to world peace. And so you have this kind of imagined relationship within kind of the pages of this journal, which kind of offers a kind of a different vision of Japan's relationships with the Arab world, in which you have a very strong critique of Japan's neutrality in Israel-Palestine, a call for greater alignment with Arab states, but also contributions, as I mentioned, from people like Bahi Eddin Nasser, was representative of the League of Arab States, who kind of took on this messaging and this kind of very binary approach to understanding international affairs. Talking about relations between Japan and the Arab state date back over 2 centuries or more. Both Japanese and Arab cultures are Eastern traditional cultures. They have so much is what's meant in common. And it's true that both cultures adopted some phony traditions from the Western culture, but it is time for Eastern cultures, including Arab and Japanese, to preserve their own heritage. And so here's kind of to kind of wrap up on Nakatani before heading over to Libya. While he was kind of one of these figures who was somewhat influential within Pan-Asianist movements prior to the war, and it would be interesting to learn and hear more about his pre-war history. At the end, he was close. He was somebody who interacted with and kind of traveled with, at times, these delegations that were organized through the Japan-Arab Association to capitals in the Arab world, interacted with both Japanese diplomats, but also kind of representatives from Middle East. And so when he died in 1990, he was kind of remembered in glowing terms by people like, for example, the ambassador of Egypt to Japan, who described him as a friendly person that through his travels could establish the Japan-Arab Association. This association, according to the Egyptian ambassador, played a significant role promoting Arab-Japanese international understanding. And to speak of Egypt, Nakatani was able to meet with our 3 great leaders, Nasser, Sadat, and Mubarak, and to maintain close relations with successive Egyptian ambassadors in Tokyo. And likewise, kind of he had a similarly kind of glowing kind of remembrance from the director of the League of Arab States, Hikmat Soliman, who kind of wrote that he had made tireless efforts in his lifelong contributions for cementing ties of friendship and mutual understanding between Japan and the Arab world for more than 30 years. Ever since, he has been kind of one of the founders of the Japan-Arab Association in Tokyo, and kind of going on to talk more about a lot of the kind of other efforts kind of at a personal level that Nakatani was engaged with. And so one of the interesting questions that arose was kind of, if we kind of flip through the pages of the Arab, this seems like very out of sync and out of line with Japan's foreign policy. How much did these ideas matter? Did they form kind of thinking among kind of others beyond this person. And to explore that, as I mentioned, we're going to look at Japan-Libya relations from kind of 57 to 99. And really, it's more from 71 from Japan's side to 1999. And Libya is interesting because there's so many different aspects of Japan's other relationships that kind of come together here in this kind of, in terms of population, small country, but in terms of landmass, huge country in North Africa on the southern shores of the Mediterranean. And so when Libya became independent in 51 under King Idris al-Senussi, Libyan foreign policy was gravitated towards, of course, the US and the UK, two countries that the Senussi monarchy cultivated close relationships with. Also in terms of security, both countries had established bases in Libya. Libya was also, though, at independence, kind of among the world's poorest countries, that its main export at the time in the 1950s was scrap metal that was left behind from the armies of Germany and kind of the Axis and the Allies, which had fought, had turned Libya into a battlefield during the Second World War. So selling scrap metal from like destroyed tanks and military vehicles and such. But during the Second World War, the US established a base, Wheelus Air Base in Tripoli. It was established in 1943 and became, for some period of time, the largest US military base outside of the United States. It was kind of a freewheeling place with kind of theaters, all sorts of like schools, of course, hospitals, all sorts of other kind of this infrastructure that surrounds these types of these kind of military outposts. But by 1959, when oil was discovered, strategically it was less important, but it became also a place where a lot of Americans who went to Libya with the American oil industry would send their children to school on the base and such. But of course, following the 1969 coup, which brought Muammar Gaddafi to power, the US handed Wheelus over to Libya. Now, following Libya's independence, there was initially little interest, of course, understandably little interest in Tokyo regarding Libya. Libya was not among the countries visited by Japan's first official kind of post-war delegations to the region. And it took several years for Japan after Libya's independence to establish diplomatic relations with Tripoli in 1957. But things began to change. For a couple of reasons. One was kind of the discovery of oil, but also, of course, in 1969, you had the kind of a coup in Tripoli led by, here you see kind of Muammar, a very young Muammar Gaddafi, a coup that was inspired by the Egyptian Free Officers movement and other kind of military-led revolts elsewhere. And Gaddafi, along with a small group of others, seized power. Now, again, kind of ideologically malleable over the years, but initially kind of Pan-Arabist, and one of the initial aims was to secure Libyan control over the country's massive oil resources from Western domination. And you had 1971, the first kind of official delegation from Japan, which included business representatives and foreign ministry officials and trade representatives, travel there as kind of like a afterthought and extension of a trip that was taking place to other countries in the region. And this was the first delegation to visit Gaddafi's Libya. And kind of somewhat surprisingly or interestingly, of course, this person is involved, who I mentioned earlier. Nakatani helped organize through the auspices of the Japan-Arab Association this 5-country tour of the Middle East in 1971. And he was somebody who very much admired Gaddafi. So he kind of talked about the nervousness of Japanese officials visiting Tripoli, because at the time, of course, there was no embassy, and the delegation was very unsure of what they could expect. It turned out to be a fascinating visit to the country. They were housed at a hotel in central Tripoli, and I understand that a kind of handmade Japanese flag was prepared for to welcome this delegation. But what's interesting are some of the kind of the conversations that take place during this encounter. And so the Japanese delegation met Deputy Prime Minister Abdesalam Jalloud, but don't let his title fool you. He was a very influential person. He was kind of Gaddafi's right-hand person at the time. He held numerous ministerial portfolios, and Jalloud had claimed to have been familiar with Japan's Meiji Restoration and claimed or told his guests that they sought to apply the lessons of this revolution of Japan's state-owned state building process to Libya. And Jalloud argued, or kind of flattered his guests by telling him that describing Japan's heroic economic recovery, offered many lessons for Gaddafi's Libya and opportunities for technological and economic cooperation. Of course, the actual opportunities for technological and economic cooperation were somewhat limited because at the time, Gaddafi's interest was largely centered around the acquisition of arms, something that, of course, Japan could not provide or would not provide at the time. But it's clear from these visits that Nakatani, kind of although ideologically fluid, admires basically strongman authoritarian rulers. He was struck by the fact that Gaddafi's government, or he kind of argued that had gained the trust and support of the nation, and had this kind of almost kind of this argument that states that experienced what he described as nationalist revolutions or national revolutions were somehow more stable. And he continued to view international politics through this colonial imperial lens and had a natural affinity. There was natural affinity between his worldview and also Gaddafi's Pan-Arab ideology. He also wrote that he saw Libya and other Arab states at risk of economic exploitation by the West, that these were states that, if integrated into the global capitalist system, would be subject to kind of the pillaging of their resources and impoverishments of their peoples. And he believed that Japan was still an anti-colonial power. Again, kind of to put I guess a disclaimer there, kind of anti-colonial in the sense that it was anti-Western colonial, I should say. He was not obviously anti-Japanese colonial. But he sought to impress upon his Libyan hosts that cooperation with Japan could be achieved on better terms with the West. And this is something that resonated with a lot of business and trade interests in Tokyo that were seeking to secure kind of deals and contracts in Libya. And as these ideas travel through time and space, we mentioned Libya, we cannot not mention the governor of Tokyo, Yuriko Koike, who has kind of written kind of books on her experience working in Libya, and even in her involvement in the promotion of Libya in the 2000s after the dropping of sanctions against Gaddafi. And of course, kind of in that circle around Nakatani Takeyo was Koike's father, Yujiro Koike, who was also involved in the oil business, but from kind of what I understand, was kind of a failed politician in a way, but somebody who had very strong kind of business and other interests, kind of, I guess, in the Middle East and the Arab world, and had worked to impress upon Yuriko Koike the importance of this region for Japan, and also kind of an interest in the Arabic language and cultures. And of course, Koike herself studied in Cairo. And this was also, as mentioned earlier on when I talked about the creation of a Japanese studies department around a similar time, Japanese studies became a department at Cairo University. And she also visited Libya first briefly in 1971, but also in 1973 as an interpreter for Japanese oil interests. And then, of course, 1978, she interviews Muammar Gaddafi. That's the same year that the Japan-Libya Friendship Association was established in 1978. And one of the interesting things here in terms of kind of these movement between kind of cultural associations and diplomacy is that these, I guess, benign sounding friendship associations do have influential people behind them. The Japan-Libya Friendship Association was first headed by former foreign minister and also former chief cabinet secretary to Prime Minister Eisaku Sato, Toshio Kimura. And in 1979, Kimura led a delegation of the Friendship Association to Tripoli to meet with Gaddafi and also assess prospects for deepening economic ties between Libya and Japan. And these did enjoy success. In December 1980, Kobe Steel won a tender worth 160 billion yen to build a steel-making plant in Misrata, which is today kind of known as like the mythical city of opposition of Libyan revolution against Gaddafi, was also known as an industrial city, having produced steel that was exported beyond Libya. And kind of also Kobe Steel had won additional orders in 1981. In 1985, another Japanese delegation was dispatched to Libya to attend the 1969 revolution's 16th anniversary ceremony in Sabah. The delegation, was dispatched under the auspices of the Japan-Libya Friendship Association. Obviously, the 1969 16th anniversary ceremony in Sabah was organized by the Libyans themselves, but this delegation was dispatched by this Friendship Association. And you also had other people kind of moving into this world of Japan-Libya relations, particularly Kakisawa Koji from Jiminto from the LDP was part of a parliamentary delegation that traveled to Libya under the auspices of the Japan-Libya Friendship Association in 1985. And he also returned to Tripoli in 1986 to meet with Gaddafi shortly after. Because those of you paying attention to this timeline would notice that, interestingly, this is at a time when Libya was, of course, a pariah in the eyes of the United States and Washington, to visit Gaddafi and also confirm the safety of 600 strong Japanese community who were residing in Libya at the time. And Kakisawa would later write about his meeting with Gaddafi in an edited volume that was published by this association in 1990, in which he, along with other contributors to the volume, expressed a largely kind of uncritical view of Gaddafi. Generally, that was the case for almost all of these people. But in terms of Japan-US relations, in April 1986, Libyan agents were implicated in the bombing of a discotheque in Berlin, frequented by US soldiers. At the time Reagan administration responded by bombing targets in Libya, including Gaddafi's Bab al-Zizia compound in Tripoli, through kind of what was Operation El Dorado Canyon, which was very short, but involved a humongous amount of explosives being dropped over Libya in a very short period of time. And during the build up to this and this growing tensions with the West, Japan was still cultivating closer relations with Libya until 1992, which is kind of a critical juncture in Japan's relations with the country, because that's when the United Nations imposed sanctions on Libya in response to Libya's involvement in the downing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland in 1988. But there was attempts to maintain this relationship with Gaddafi's Libya. Kakisawa was at that point Japan's foreign minister, visited Tripoli twice, 1998 and 1999. But by this point, Gaddafi's interest in Japan, or excitement about Japan, had declined significantly. In fact, Japan was one of these countries that really complied with UN sanctions against Libya. In fact, in some case, might be described as kind of having over-complied with United Nations sanctions. And Gaddafi stated at the time that he expected kind of greater solidarity from Japan in the context of kind of Pan-Asian and greater Pan-Asian and Pan-African solidarity, and thought this would hold greater cachet in Tokyo. And he was also deeply disgruntled that Japan seemingly observed sanctions much more strictly than some European countries like France, which were involved in kind of deals that seemingly kind of bypassed, that subverted some of these sanctions. And that gets us to kind of some final kind of thoughts about kind of this group of travelers in Japan-Arab world relations, and also kind of these concepts and how they traveled across space and time. So I'm running out of time here, speaking of of time. But interestingly, so just for those of you looking at this picture, in case you're not familiar, of course, that is the current governor of Tokyo, before Japan governor of Tokyo, Koike Yuriko, visiting Gaddafi as kind of part of a Japanese delegation, offering a gift. And this is at the time, I believe that was like a Nintendo Wii, which was popular a couple decades ago now. I guess it's kind of an older thing, to kind of rebuild relations with Libya, the maintenance of these ties, and kind of how these discourses played out in different quarters, both within Tokyo, within kind of circles like people like Nakatani, around kind of an attempt to revive or reimagine Pan-Asianism through solidarities with other political forces, but limitations in terms of the broader context of Japanese foreign policy, but also the ability to move between these associations and diplomacy and rebuilding some of these bridges. And it was interesting in seeing kind of that the perception of Japan in these early years also was largely formed already by some of the discourses that we had heard about in the first day, and was actively perpetuated by Japanese diplomacy, and provides a little bit of context for some of that stuff. Kind of the question I started with, kind of what accounts for Japan's exceptionalism? Why does Japan see itself as something other, a different type of state in its relations with the Arab world? This kind of provides, I guess, more questions perhaps than answers at this point. And I'd be really excited to hear kind of any questions or observations that you may have. But over time, kind of the ideological rigidity kind of around some of these ideas becomes more malleable, but nonetheless, they form thinking of new generation of Japan-Arab relations interlocutors, like one who is photographed here. But this mismatch in messaging and perceptions grew over time. In fact, as I mentioned, kind of came to the head in the 1990s in relation to Japan's compliance with sanctions over Libya. So I think with that, I will conclude this presentation. I understand that Q&A will be after, so I'll hand the floor back over to Aiko and also maybe Seiko.